Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Allegiant Chats, Season 2, Episode 2. To remind you, my name is Anne Brnger, and I am thrilled once again to be joined by our President and Chief Customer Officer, Denis Guay. I will allow Denis to say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited for episode 2.
It's so great to be back with all of you, and just a brief memory from what we talked about during our season 2, episode 1. If you'll remember, we shared that the theme of our season 2 is equity, and we're looking at all of the elements that involve equity in the staffing and the work we do and the benefits, how we achieve that equity, some of the pain points, solutions. I'm giving you a bit of a preview of things to come. But to dial back just a little bit and focus in on what today's conversation is going to be between Denis and I, I'm going to start with a question and let Denis sort of take it from there, and we'll dialogue as we go. So, Denis, as you think about equity, which can be very broad, but in the sort of the term and the sense that we're talking about it today, talk to us about the role that HR can play in increasing equity among their staff.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, it's such a wild question because I think it's evolving in front of our eyes. So, HR has always seen their role, as kind of looking after the staff and making sure that they're being the kind of the internal advocates to, curate the best benefits, negotiate the best cost, take care of them, right? And so when I think about their role for local nationals, it's really the same kind of things, right? And so, but we have to think about it a little differently. So I like to think of it as, HR, because this is new and evolving in front of our eyes. I think they need to view themselves as champions of change for the local national staff. And they need to think about this in a couple different ways, in my opinion, at least. Is one, I think they need to approach establishing a minimum standard of benefits for their organization. So basically, adopting a philosophy that says we are going to set a minimum standard of benefits for all of our staff, regardless of the employee type, right? So, regardless if they're a US local or they're a US expatriate or a third country national, or in our case, for our conversation today, a local national, right? We're going to adopt this minimum standard. And they can do that pretty easily in terms of getting a basic agreement and things like, we just are not going to accept exclusions for, maternity care, as
Right.
basic as that sounds, right?
Yep.
Anne, from
Absolutely.
having conversations is, lots of times these local plans will have exclusions that are just not aligned with the minimum standard that we would expect. And so we shouldn't have that be acceptable for our local national staff. So things like I said, maternity, but also things like HIV, AIDS, or cancer, or COVID-19, right? We know that there are lots of local plans that have an exclusion for those types of things. And what we're
Yeah,
just
that,
basically,
Denis, and I'm also thinking I've also seen waiting periods as another, piece to sort of reckon with.
yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, yeah, we'll cover this, but only after 2 years. Or, and those are just things like, I mean, I'll ask you, Ann, in your old HR days, like, is that something you would accept for your US staff?
Yeah, not it wouldn't even be a consideration. And that's why I think it's been so daunting in some ways as HR professionals delve into this equity conversation. And I know you're going to touch on researching and understanding and defining, but to see some of those limitations, it can be a little bit like, deer in the headlights, like, oh my gosh, where do we go now? And how can we ever possibly meet equity? Because that just isn't something that we would ever accept on the US side.
Right. And I think it can be overwhelming to HR too. It's like, well,
Hmm.
where do we start? Like, okay, we want to, yes, we hear you, Dennis and Ann and Allegiant, and we want to establish a minimum standard, but where do we start? And then my
Hmm.
answer to that is you look at some core aspects of a health plan, and you even take your US health plan as the point of reference, right? And let's think of it as what would you define your minimum benefit standard for inpatient care or outpatient care or emergency services, or even more detailed, like major health concerns? Meaning, like, how do you want care for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, diagnostic care, things like that? And you don't have to be, a healthcare strategist to determine these things. You can just look at your own experience in HR and your own benefit design and start to categorize what you would consider to be major care points in your health plan and determine internally what those minimum essential benefits would look like. And then once you do that, my recommendation is you take that minimum standard, you document it, and you have conversations with decision makers to say, hey, this is what we would like to adopt as a minimum standard. And here's how we've come to those conclusions. We've looked at our US based plans, we've looked at these things, we've done research and analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we've come up with these standards. So, I mean, and that's kind of what I'm thinking. Do you think that that is relatable kind of in the HR world, like how you would approach something like this?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Dennis. And I think it's embedded in what you're describing is to also be sure that all of us are eliciting and partnering with our in-country, whether they be chief of parties or product directors or country managers, whatever those titles are. There's a wonderful synergy that takes place where, as an HR professional, you can come to them with that minimum standard and then really look to see how that resonates with the in-country staff relative to the needs of the team. So I think you're spot on. I think that there's been tremendous progress made in these areas in terms of the offerings and the way that we can go about meeting some of these equity standards. But I think you've laid out a wonderful roadmap, Dennis, to start to be thinking about where do you start? Where do you put pen to paper? So I think that's fabulous.
I think what our kind of building on that, and I think one of our challenges that I think our HR teams will experience is when they're actually deciding on this minimum essential strategy, and then they're approaching the marketplace for solutions, they're going to see some challenges with getting particularly like local sourced health plans,
Hmm.
meaning health insurance entities that are domiciled in the geography that we're trying to solve for. I think you'll find some challenges there because the norms are not to cover all of these things we would deem as essential or minimum standards. And so I think there's going to be some learning that has to happen. And then I think our HR teams have to take a step back and say, okay, like if we can't solve this basic essential need locally, we have to think differently. And that's where you want to start thinking about globally sourced health plans and
Hmm.
looking at plans that maybe are still tailored towards local nationals, but offer a more broader definition of coverage so that we can meet the minimum standard. So that's kind of just, my experience tells me the EHR team will be challenged when they're trying to source these things locally as a minimum standard. But when they take it one notch up and try to look at a regional global player, they're going to be more successful.
Yeah, I think that's fabulous. And I think that's a great note to end today's conversation is, and again, as HR professionals, sort of thinking about what are the things that you can be doing. And I think that, to sort of sum up, it's around researching, it's around defining those minimum standards, and it's about proposing those solutions both locally and globally as the needs dictate. So Dennis, thank you. Always a pleasure to chat with you on these things. I know we could spend hours talking about them. So more conversation to come. You can have a precursor, all of you out there listening, to our next episode, which is going to delve into more around how we as a team, how Allegiant Global Partners as a team can really partner with our nonprofits when it comes to this equity conversation and how we can help make it a priority. So, on that note, I will say goodbye. Dennis, would you like to say goodbye to our audience as well?
Yes, goodbye, and thank you for listening. And I hope you're enjoying. I'm so looking forward to the next conversation because then we're gonna kind of get a little deeper into what are our strategic ideas in terms of solving for some of these challenges we've presented it in the last two episodes.
Sounds terrific. All right, everybody, we'll catch you next week. Until then.